All right, so anytime I share a laser engraved image online, I get the question, what settings did you use? And the answer to that question, you're not gonna like, because it depends. Like, what laser do you have? What material are you using? What is your image? And what do you actually want the image to look like at the end? So in this video, I wanna walk you through the step-by-step process that I use to figure out the right settings for any image on any material. And I wanna show you one setting that I was using wrong that was doubling the amount of time it was taking to do one of these, and it was making the final results worse. All right, let's jump into it. And if you want to know what settings I actually used to make this, here it is. Now let's get into how I figured that out. All right, so this is going to be an 8-step process. The first step is picking out your image. So in this case, as always, anytime I do any type of laser engraving, we are talking about Baby Yoda. So jumping over to the computer, this is the image of Baby Yoda that I am using. You can see a few things with it. First, it is pretty high resolution. I think I can zoom in pretty far. And so one of the things you want to do, but you may not always be able to do, is just get the highest resolution image possible, probably obvious. But as we go in to modify this image inside of Lightburn, which is the software that we're using, the more pixels and the more data you have inside the image, the better you're going to be able to manipulate it. So always get as high resolution as humanly possible. And then another tip in general when you're picking your images is you want to shoot for having an image that has high contrast. We're going to be able to adjust this inside of Lightburn, but you can adjust your image in some pretty easy ways. There's obviously a ton of tools that you can use. I am on a Mac, and because of that, I'm actually going to do this in Apple Photos. This is definitely something you could do on your phone as well, or on a PC. You can come over here to Edit, and then you're going to get all of these different controls to be able to adjust the contrast on the image. And what you're really trying to do is not blow out your highlights, meaning like around his face right here. If I turn up my highlights, keep on going too high, but you can see I'm starting to lose some of the detail if I get way too high. And then especially if I'm doing it on the shadows and I push this all the way down, you can see I've lost a lot of the detail. So you still want to have the detail in there, but you want to have a good range between highs and lows, because not only does that give you a better image in general, but especially when you put it to wood, it's going to read a lot better. So like if this was just a flat image without any contrast, not only would it just not be a great photo in general, but it's going to be really hard to see the details in the actual material itself, especially if you're using wood with wood grain, because it makes it a little bit harder to see. Now, another tip with the image, and this may not apply to everything, but a lot of times you want to actually remove the background just to make it more clear on whatever you're doing. That is something that I have done on this. So even though the background isn't super detailed on this, definitely if we were to laser engrave it, that would increase our time, but it would also kind of muddy the image, especially if you have a really busy background. So there are a bunch of free ways to do this. One I literally just found while I was recording this. So I'm just inside of Preview on a Mac. So like if you just open up an image, I'm coming up here to Tools. I don't know how recent this is, but there literally is a remove background tool like built directly into the operating system. And this is something like if you long press on your phone, if you're on an iPhone, it'll automatically remove the background. And I'm sure on Android, there's a bunch of tools to do this as well. So I just did that. And then if I save this, you can see it has updated to a PNG. And a PNG basically means that you can have a transparent background. Another free way to do it as well, and this actually is coming from Adobe, is Adobe Express. This is kind of a lead-in to one of their pieces of paid software, but I can just click and drag this image in that has a background, and it's more or less going to do that process that we just saw, and then you can download it and go from there. All right, so the next step is taking that image that we have adjusted and potentially remove the background, then bringing it inside of Lightburn and then getting it the right physical dimensions that we want it to be. So I am inside of Lightburn. I'm going to pull in my PNG. You can see that we have that background removed. And you can obviously just size things pretty easily by clicking and dragging. You can also adjust the width and the height up here. But one thing that can be kind of annoying is you can see we have that red box going around, and that is because the PNG is still sized with that background in there. So we are going to put a mask on this to kind of block those out. But you could also do this, like maybe you want this as a circle. So you want this image to live inside of a circle or a star or whatever. In our case, we're just going to do a square. And they make it pretty easy. So what we are going to do is use a tool layer. So down at the very bottom of Lightburn, I know it's kind of cut off on my computer because it's being weird, but you can see a bunch of different numbers for all of our different layers. And actually our image is on layer 2, it looks like, so red. Over at the far right, you're gonna have T1 and T2. Those are tool layers. So I am gonna click just T1, and then I'm gonna come over here and click Create Rectangle. And then I'm going to click and drag. If I hold Shift, it's gonna make it a square. And I'm gonna drop it, let's say like right there. Now, if I was to go in and click again, it's gonna make another rectangle. I'm gonna hit Command Z because I don't want that. Instead, I'm gonna go back to the arrow, or if you just hit Escape, it like defaults to the arrow, so you don't have to worry about that. I know it's something that I always wind up messing up. Now, it gets kind of hard because this is on the red layer. I'm gonna move this to the blue layer. Because it's kind of hard to tell between that and the tool layer. So I've got my image selected, and then I'm gonna go ahead and put it on, let's do it on 0, because that's probably what yours brought it in as. So now we have our image, still with the border around it, and then you can see our tool inside of it. So I'm going to select my square and kind of resize it. I want to cut off right at the bottom and make it a little bit bigger for his ears. And actually it doesn't have to be a perfect square, so I'm gonna kind of size it even closer to his ears. So now what we can do is select both things. So I am going to click and drag. I'm coming in from the left, so I actually have a green box. And if you haven't seen this inside of Lightburn, all that means is anything that you select, even if it's just a piece of it, it's gonna automatically select it. So like if I let it go, I have both things selected, versus if I did it to the right, so I'm gonna like click and drag to the right, let go, it's not gonna select anything because it wants you to go around like the entire thing. So I typically do it from the left and get that little green box. If that ever pops it for you, I know that can be kind of confusing at first. Okay, so I have both of those things connected. Now I'm going to right click, and then I'm going to apply mask to image because we literally are making a square mask for the image. And I believe it has to be on a tool layer for the mask to work. So I'm gonna hit apply mask. Now you can see that if I move my image around, it's going to be confined within that square, so I probably could like adjusted it after the fact because I still have the ability to adjust this up and down. But so that's cool. You can leave it there if you want, or if you like what you've got, what you can do is again select it. So pulling from the left to get the green box, right clicking and do flatten image to mask. So it's going to remove the fact that it's a masked image. It's basically like going to delete anything that you've masked out. So you're not going to have access back to that information. So just make sure you're good to go. So I'm going to flatten it. And now we literally just have a square for our image. I'm going to back out a little bit and I want to do the same thing, but this time we're going to do a circle. So again, I'm drawing in a circle, and yeah, that circle is actually on a normal layer. So I'll make sure that is on a tool layer. Again, click, apply mask. So it has to be on the tool layer, and you're gonna get that same effect, but this time within a circle. Okay, so I went back to the square, but now we have our image that is cropped the way that we want it because you might actually need to crop it to the material itself. So like one thing you could do is you can make the frame literally the size of your material, just measure it out, and then scale the image to that frame so it's gonna fit the way you want it on your material. Another tip, and this is something we are going to come back to a bunch, is you can make image adjustments to a bitmap image, which is what this is, inside of Lightburn. So if you have it selected, I hit and I right click again and I go over to adjust image. Now you're going to see that we have a bunch of different things that we can adjust inside of Lightburn. Several of these we're actually going to test out so you can see what is the best result for you. But one of them is the image mode, and you can definitely play around with this. You can try running it with different image modes to see what works the best. I typically find Jarvis is going to be the best one for most of the stuff that I do, so that's normally what I keep it on. Line interval, DPI, these are connected. We are going to get into that a lot here in a second. But the big thing is, so you can actually zoom in and out on these images. And so what's going on in the left is like the image, how it's showing up in Lightburn. But if I zoom in, this is how the image is actually showing up in terms of the laser. So it's just going to be white or black dots, meaning is the laser on or is the laser off. So you can adjust like contrast, brightness, and gamma. Brightness is going to be brightness. Gamma basically means those are like the darks. So it's going to increase or decrease the darks. And so what I find is also helpful is to adjust this while looking at how the laser is going to look at it. Because let's say I turn my brightness like all the way up. You can definitely tell when you zoom in, the laser isn't firing in these huge areas. So there is going to be no detail because the laser isn't doing anything. So I find having dots in pretty much all of the shades of gray is going to give you detail unless you want some spots completely blown out, like the whites in the eyes. And what's also cool is if you adjust this, you can see how the image modes are going to affect your image. As well as the DPI, and then you can play around with like the radiuses and enhancements, but we're not going to do that in this guy. All right, for step 3, let's talk about the 2 most important things that you're going to have with your settings for a laser. That is speed, and that is the power. Now you might have dialed some of this in already. You know, like if you're going to do text, what's going to be a pretty good setting to use. But if you haven't, let me show you kind of what I would do. And that is using basically a material test. So Lightburn actually has this function built into it. So if you come up here to laser tools, come down to material tests, and then it's going to make a test grid that's going to vary the speed and the power. I'm just going to keep this one all stock, and I'm going to show you what the preview looks like. And you can see you're going to get like a test card. That is more or less what I did with this guy right here. And you're going to be able to find settings that work well. A couple things to keep in mind when you're looking at this. One is you're really trying to optimize for speed, but still getting the result that you want. Now, there's a lot that are more or less the same shade of gray. And what you're really trying to do is kind of find like, what is the fastest I can run this, still get a good result. Depending on what type of laser you're using, you may not want to run it at 100% power. Typically with glass DC CO2 tubes, you don't run them at 100% just to kind of save on the life of the tube. In my case, I am using the One Laser XRF, which is an RF beam on the back. Now, one thing you do want to watch out for is there's a difference between dark and then like burn, which you obviously can see here at the bottom. I was definitely getting a ton of charring. I'm not using air assist typically when I engrave. I find I actually get better results. So you're getting the full effect of the char here at the bottom. But that dark char is actually a result you're not going to want to get, because a lot of times when you go deeper and deeper into the material, it isn't like you're getting darker and darker. Sometimes you can actually get lighter. So I found that if I have my power actually too high, I'm going to get a worse result, because I basically have pushed it past what a dark engrave should look like. Because really our goal is to slightly engrave the surface of the material. We're not trying to engrave into the material. That's good for doing like solid fill engraves. Now that's going to be very evident when we move into our next step. That is another speed and power test, but this time we are going to do it with the actual image that we are using. And so what I like to do is basically like get a section of the image that has a lot of high contrast. A lot of times the eye is a good one to pick. You might see a lot of people using that online as well. So I'm going to do another mask on this image. I'm going to hit the square. I'm going to come down here to the tool layer. I'm going to do it right over his left eye. Then I'm going to select both things. I'm going to hit apply mask, and then I'm going to go ahead and flatten this one as well, because we're going to set up our own test grid, and that's actually what I've done down here. This one I varied it from 400 to 1200 millimeters per second, from 20 to 80%. And I'm using the eye to get a better idea of how those details will read in the image. But to show you actually how to do this in Lightburn, so you're not going to use the material test tool, which you've got at the top. I believe that just makes a solid square. So if you want to do anything else, you kind of have to make it manual, but there's a few things that helps you do that. So I'm going to select it. I'm going to come over here to the left, and there is this create array of selected objects. So make sure you have the eye selected, hit that. And then kind of like the material test, you're going to get the options to basically create a grid. And in my case, I think I did 4x4. And then you can like adjust the width, the padding, all that kind of stuff from there. And then from here, what you would do is you'd go ahead and add a text layer. So I'm going to go and just write in some text. And then I'm going to make sure this is on my black layer. And this is on fill. then you like copy and paste this around for your text. In the settings for the text, you'll already know what is a good one to use for speed and power based off the one that we just did. But then what you got to do is assign individual values to each one of these. And you could put these on individual layers because your speed and your power settings apply to the entire layer. But there's one thing that Lightburn does that makes this a little bit easier, and that is called power scale. But before we show that, we need to actually get into this image. So you can see this is still like all grouped together. So if I right click it and I hit ungroup, and then I'm going to have individual control of each of these. So I went ahead and added in the text. And then one thing you can do, if you didn't know, there's a ton of alignment tools inside of Lightburn as well. So I went in and using that like drag to the left to get my green, select everything, then coming up to the top, that's where your alignment tools live. And then I want everything to be aligned to the right edge. It looks good. And then using my arrow keys, you can kind of move this around. If you hold Shift, it's going to move it larger, and if you hold Command, it's going to get even more fine, and then Shift and Command gets even more fine. So I find that's actually a lot easier to move stuff around versus kind of dragging and dropping with a mouse. And then we'll go ahead and do the percentages as well. So I'm just copying and pasting. And we're going to go ahead and select everything. And then I'm going to use the alignment for the top edge this time. All right, so now we have our text layer, and I've set mine at 800 speed and then 40% on my power. But now I need to go in and assign individual values to each of these. So what we're going to do is split this up by speed, because there is a function called power scale, which you can get to under the shape properties over here on the right. And again, if your stuff looks a little bit different, if you come up to the top, hit the window, and then shape properties will be a drop down. A lot of times it's not actually turned on, so make sure you've got that turned on. Come over to shape properties, and then this is going to be a property that is specific to whatever you have selected. So this isn't layer wide. So this is how you can like drill into specific things. And so when I do that, you can see one of the things that you can do is the power scale. And this is kind of confusing, but it's basically a percentage of whatever the max power is for the layer. And we'll set all that power scale here in a minute, but hopefully to make it a little bit easier to follow along, let's go ahead and put all of our different speeds, again, that is the 1200 to 400 millimeters per second, on their own layer. So this is going to be 400. I'm going to make this layer 1. This one is going to be 600, layer 2, 800, and then 1200. And I'm using a file that I actually had already set up. That's why it's giving me like automatic names for these layers, but this one's actually wrong. So if I double click into it, then you can switch it over. This is where you can name everything up there. Although actually I do want that as 1000, don't I? I was going by 200, so let me adjust this. And then we'll go in here and we'll adjust all of our settings, going from 400 to 600, 800 to 1000. And then one thing I also want to adjust as well is my power. Since I'm using the power scale, I actually want to set this to 100, and I'm going to have my min at 0. And we're not going to get into like the min and the max, but normally that's going to apply more to like grayscale stuff, not really what we're doing with right here. So I'm doing 100 and 0 for all of those. And then within the layer settings itself, you have an option for air on or off, and I just have mine turned off. But you also have access to that right there as well. So now we have a text layer, which is a layer 0, then 1 through 4, where the only thing that is changing is the speed. But we want to change the power coming out as well. So again, using the drag to the left, I am selecting this column, so everything that's going to be 80%. Coming over to my shape properties, and instead of 100, it's going to be 80. And then kind of moving on from there, making sure not to select the 60. So then, if I go in and I'm going to have my shape property pulled up, if I just select some random stuff, so that one is at 60, this one's at 40, that one's at 20. You can see we are getting individual settings for those blocks versus having to put every single one of those on their own layer. And then especially if you're doing like a big one like this, which is like a 15 by 10, I think, you're gonna run out of layers. And I wind up doing stuff like this a bunch, and that's basically my process to make a test grid, but do it manually. Okay, so now that I have this, then I can send it to the laser and to run it, which I've already done. And so we have our results right there. But I actually wanna show you results from one I did earlier to kind of show you what is happening when you add in too much power. So the eyes are a pretty good example of it, to where it's still dark, but it's actually charring the wood, and then it's getting deeper into the wood, and then sometimes we're actually getting a lighter result as it goes deeper. And it's really easy to see. I didn't run it the full way, but down here at the bottom, so like this side should actually be darker than this side, and you can see as we're going deeper into the wood, the Engrave is actually getting lighter. So that is why you may not pick something that looks the darkest at first glance, but it will give you the best result because you really can't get that dark to get a true Engrave, or you have to play around with a lot of settings. So you want to get something to where you can get as dark as possible, but without going deep into the wood. And that is what this test is basically trying to do, which I did the correct versions. And then basically all I'm doing on the test itself is just kind of seeing where I think some of the best detail is going to be. And so I did run this one, and I found that actually I had my power turned up too high. A lot of these eyes are way too dark. So I came over here and then I turned my power down. So I ran it from 10 to 25, just doing exactly what we did right there. And then I think I found something around this 1,000 millimeters per second, and then 20% power. Looks like to be a pretty good ballpark to move to our next step. All right, so this setting was the one that I had wrong, and it would make my engravings take way too long, and I wouldn't get the result that I needed. And that is actually DPI, or you might also see it as line interval. And actually line interval is an easier way to think about it. And so all line interval is you've got your laser going across and making a laser beam, then it moves and does another one. From the center of those two lines, that distance is your line interval. And I actually ran this test where we would go from 50 DPI all the way up to 950 DPI to kind of see what the different results would look like. And you got to play around with the power settings a little bit too, because as you go to higher DPIs, we're actually going deeper and deeper into the wood. And why that's happening is going to make a lot more sense here in a second. But first, you kind of need to figure out what the maximum DPI theoretically is for your laser. So in my case, I'm using a 38-watt RF tube from one laser, and they're giving me a spot size, so the laser dot, as 0.05 millimeters. Image R, which I'm gonna do a whole video about them in the future, they make a lot of this manual stuff that we're doing for images easier, but sometimes you have to pay for it. And they basically give you what's your maximum DPI based off of your dot size. So coming all the way down here at the bottom, 0.05, gives me a little over 500 DPI. In practice, I find that's actually a lot less. And so to show you what is actually going on, I have a video microscope and these lights out so it's easier to see. So this is that line interval, but you can tell right there is the thickness of our laser beam. So the idea is at some point when your line interval is so small that the beam is actually going to be overlapping with itself. So at 250, you can see we've got a little bit of a gap between the beams. But then at 350, we have a little less of a gap, 450, less of a gap, and then finally at 550, we really don't have much of a gap at all. And definitely once we hit 650, we are over that. And then sometimes manufacturers will say like 1,000 DPI if maybe you're using like a really low powered diode laser. But again, I would encourage you to run one of these tests to actually see like what is the point where you're starting to go deeper and deeper into the wood versus just having more lines going across. And in this one, you can kind of see that around the 3 to 450 range, we start to go deeper into the wood. And this will also be like dependent on the type of material that you're using. So wood, we're actually getting some charring on the edges as well as the actual like laser beam itself versus like an anodized aluminum card. You're not going to see that as much. But hopefully like you're seeing a common trend on this video is to test this out. And so that is what I have pulled up right here. And that's actually what this step is for this test, is we're testing a bunch of different DPIs with that eye to kind of see what looks the best. So I'm using the speed and power that I found in the last step and then running this from there. Now this one doesn't use power scale because I want to keep the power the same. The only thing I want to change is the DPI. And so if I jump into each of these layers, you can see these are changing from 150, DPI is right there, 250, 350, 450. Now I'm using DPI here because it's easier to look at, but like you just saw, a better way to think about it is the actual line interval, whether that's in millimeters or inches. All right, so I ran that, and what I was finding is I was getting more or less the best results at 250. Definitely once I got to 450, I was just making the image darker and darker versus giving me more detail in the image itself. All right, for our next step, and this one isn't required, but this is a cool setting that you can do inside of Lightburn. So the line interval is basically the height of the dot. You can also adjust the width of the dot. Because as you're firing it going back and forth, you might find that it's not giving you a dot, but it's actually elongating the dot. So there's a setting inside of these layers that's called the dot width correction. And sometimes you'll see other people talk about this in percentages. But basically you can use your line interval is basically the maximum that you can use and then adjust it down from there. The smaller the correction, the smaller the impact. And just like with everything else, I encourage you guys to run a test to see what is going to happen. So that is what this guy is right here at the top, where I go from 0%, so I don't adjust anything, then up to 80%, and so I'm just doing that. So then 20% would just be 0.1 times 0.2 to give me 0.02 as my actual dot width correction. But what you're gonna find is this is kind of like you are adjusting the brightness up. So things are gonna get a little bit lighter, but a lot of times this is gonna give you better detail in your midtone regions. All right, and this is a zoomed in image of the eye. And so this is with no correction applied, meaning that it's not making these dots any smaller. But as we go across, go into the new image, now we're at 20%. You can see we're starting to get more of a gap between them. 40%, getting more of a gap. And again, this is an image, that's why it's like changing as we're going across. But if I go to a completely new image, which is here, now we're at 60%. Finally, when we're at 80%, we have a good bit of a gap between it. So here is 80 at pretty much the same spot, and here is none at pretty much the same spot. And then our second to last test is one we've already done. It's basically rerunning the speed and the power test, but with the line interval and the dot width that you found that works. Because a lot of times I find you might need to bump up the power or slow it down to get it a tad bit darker. And basically the way I did that was I just ran the full image at a few different powers over here on the far left to kind of get an idea of which one I thought would look the best. And also now that I'm using more of the image, I can get a better idea about how the whole thing is going to work. Finally, our last step isn't required, but it is going into that adjust image, and then either adjusting the image mode and or adjusting the contrast, the brightness, the gamma. And then also you can play around with the enhance radius and the enhance amount. So you can make like a test file for this as well. But there are a lot of other like finicky things you can do to further dial in the image. But I'm kind of looping all those up into one big step to where finally you are able to do a full-size engrave, which brings me to some bonus tips. First is grain direction if you're using wood. I actually talked about this in this like double inlay that I did recently. There's a link right up there for the full tutorial if you want to do it, where I'm using a maple veneer and I'm doing a reverse inlay into walnut. Super, super cool effect. But I said in that, you're gonna get the best result if you are running it against the grain, which is not actually what I did with this one. So if the grain was running up and down, you would want to do your engrave this way. Typically find that looks a little bit better. So this one, we've got it going up and down, where with this one, we've got it going side to side. But I find actually seeing the grain lines going up and down read a little bit easier than side to side. Then material choice, another big tip, is that's gonna look a lot different depending on what you're doing. This is all like birch plywood, but if you engrave this on other different types of wood, I believe this is cherry, but it's actually a pretty light cherry. So the results are okay, but this was like a plywood veneer, and I think it's mahogany. I found I was getting a much darker burn on this versus on this. There are a few ways to like artificially make your burn darker. People will use borax. I haven't done that, but I plan to do a video. But basically you're putting a chemical on top of your wood and then burning that material. So you're kind of cheating it, but you are getting like a final result, especially if you clear coat it. And then a bonus is, and we're gonna do a whole series on acrylic, which is what this guy is. And I'm gonna try to put it So it's like over a dark background. What I love about acrylic, especially clear acrylic, which you can't do with like a traditional diode laser, you have to have a CO2, is you could do a flip of the image on the back. And then when you flip it around, you have like a built-in clear coat. And actually jumping into the video microscope, you can see how those laser dots are working on this as well. But acrylic is also cool. So I don't have this in a base, but you can see if you light it from the edges, you can get a really cool effect. And you can make that whatever color you want if you've got color LEDs. So for something clear like this, where the background will actually wind up being darker than what you're engraving, you need to get a negative image, and a light burn actually makes that really easy. I'm just gonna jump into an individual layer, so this applies to the entire layer. There's literally a toggle where it jumps it over to a negative image. And actually, since I have a bunch on here, if I come up here to the top, hit preview, you can see this one right here is our negative. And again, I find when doing that, come up to adjust image, because now the brightness and the gamma are gonna be flipped. So you might need to dial it in to where you are getting some detail like inside of the eye, which before would have been like completely blown out. All right, now if you don't want to do a photo and you're thinking more something like a vector image, we're gonna jump into the full tutorial on how to make this right now. So until next time, go make or break something in your shop. See you guys.